Welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Karel Huidekoper and today I have a treat for you because we are going to look at this fantastically beautiful Descent from the Cross by Rogier van Weyden, or if you prefer, Roger de le Pasteur, made round about 1435. It's one of those paintings that's not just spectacular, but it also turned out to be a key work in art history. So today I'm going to discuss this in a few different parts. First, we're going to have a look at the life and time of Rogier van Weyden, and then we're going to have a much closer look at the painting itself and see all the people that are depicted on it. And then I'll tell you a little about the influence on art history in general, because this is, as I said, one of those works that revolutionized art. But first, let me remind you to hit the thumbs up button if you like this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. All you do is click the button below the video and then the little bell icon for notifications. So, Rogier van Weyden, who is also known as Roger de le Pasteur or Roger de la Pasteur, as both the le and la variants were used during his lifetime. It means Roger of the Meadow, van Weyden being the Flemish version and Pasteur the French one. He was born in Tournai, in what is now southern Belgium, around 1400, which was and is a French-speaking part of the world. But at some point he moved to Brussels, where he spent most of his career, and there he used the Flemish translation of his name. He was a very successful artist. He became the official painter for the city of Brussels, a title, it seems, that was created especially for him. And it meant that he would paint the works for the municipality of Brussels, which he did. During his career he made a number of works for City Hall, for instance. The trouble is that none of them are left, so I can't show you any of them. And he also worked extensively for the court of the Dukes of Burgundy. In particular, he would work for Philip the Good of Burgundy. This, for instance, is a portrait of Philip the Good. Actually, it's a copy after one made by Rogier van Weyden. And this is one of the tragedies of his work, one that luckily he never knew about. But he made a large number of portraits and other paintings for the court that, at the time, was one of the most sumptuous in all of Europe. Many of those portraits and paintings were in the palace op de Koudenberg in Brussels, and that was burned to the ground in 1731. Actually, quite a few of his works, the ones he had made for the municipality of Brussels, had already been lost when the French bombed Brussels in 1695 and the city centre burned down. That's one of the reasons that when you see portraits like these, they are copies of the originals by Rogier van Weyden. Now, his main patrons were the city of Brussels and Philip the Good of Burgundy. For Philip the Good, he made portraits, but also some miniatures, like this exquisite one that you can still find in the Bibliothèque Royale de Belgique, which is the Royal Library of Belgium in Brussels. But he also took on a large number of different commissions. He was about a decade younger than Jan van Eyck, and was clearly very much aware of the work of both Jan and Hubert van Eyck, in particular the Ghent altarpiece that was unveiled in 1432. And it's clear that he learned a lot from the older masters in the Low Countries who had perfected the techniques of working in oil paint. But Rogier added his own twist to his work that make it so uniquely different from the other painters of his time. And that twist, for the lack of a better word, is emotion. Now, I'm a big fan of Jan van Eyck, and I've made a series of videos about his work. I've put the links to those in the description, but there's one thing lacking in it, and that is emotion. A while ago, someone wrote in a comment to one of my videos that he thought that Van Eyck's figures looked dead. And although I can't really agree with him, I can see the point. They are beautifully painted, but their facial expressions are completely neutral. And there's a huge difference when you look at Rogier van Weyden, and especially this Descent from the Cross, because it's the emotions that make this such a gripping and moving painting. And you might say that one of the main contributions by Rogier van Weyden in early Netherlandish paintings is precisely those emotions. Now, as a group, we used to call painters like the Van Eyck brothers and Rogier van Weyden the Flemish primitives, but that's a term that we don't really use today, mainly because they were anything but primitive. And so today we prefer to use the term Early Netherlandish painters. Now, we used to call them primitive because it was thought that most of these Flemish painters were illiterate and were seen as craftsmen rather than artists, people who worked with their hands rather than with their minds. But in recent decades our perspective has shifted. For instance, we now think that Rogier van Weyden traveled to Italy and was in contact with some of the leading artists of his generation in the rest of Europe, and that he was a valued member of the Burgundy court, as Jan van Eyck had been before him. By the way, Rogier van Weyden didn't sign his work, which makes it more difficult for us to determine which works are by him and which are not. So we mostly have to rely on documentary evidence. Basically, we need to have a written order that commissioned a painting to be sure. And in this case, we have the second best thing, which is descriptions from shortly after it was finished that say that he made the painting. But this painting wasn't made for the Burgundy court. Instead, it was made for a guild of crossbowmen in the city of Leuven, one of the many rich cities of the Low Countries. It was actually booming at the time. 10 years before we think Roger made this descent from the cross, a university was founded here, making it the first university in the Low Countries. These days, this wonderful Gothic town hall stands next to St. Peter's Church in the city centre, but that hadn't been built yet when Rogier set to work. He was commissioned, as I said, by the Guild of Crossbowmen to make a central painting for an altarpiece for their chapel in Onze Lieve Vrouwe van Ginderbuiten, or Notre Dame hors les murs, which means Our Lady outside of the walls. And as the name suggests, it was a chapel outside of the city walls. That is, in this case, the inner city walls, because as the city grew, they built a new set of walls around the original city. And this chapel was built between the first and the second wall. However, it's no longer there. It was demolished by the French after another invasion, this time in 1798. But the thing is, you can still see that it was made for a crossbow guild, because in the corners there's this tracery, and if you look closely, you can see there's a little crossbow in there. And there's one in the other corner as well. Now, as I said, it was made as the central panel of an altarpiece, and most likely it was intended to have doors as well, but they don't seem to have been made by Rogier van Eyck, or if they were, they haven't survived. In fact, a century after it had been made, King Philip II of Spain wanted to buy it, and in the negotiations there's never any mention of the doors. Those negotiations, by the way, are a story in and of themselves. Philip II actually wasn't yet king, and so he was just Philip of Habsburg at the time, because his father, Charles V, still reigned as emperor, but Philip was the heir apparent to the Low Countries, and as such he visited the Low Countries that at the time were reigned by his aunt, Mary of Hungary, who was the governor of the Low Countries for her brother Charles V. In Dutch we call her a landvoogdes. And when Philip saw the descent from the cross, he was so impressed that he wanted to buy it, but the guild didn't want to sell. Then he tried to pressure them into selling it, which led to quite a bit of protest. And eventually Mary of Hungary intervened and negotiated on Philip's behalf. And she agreed to pay 500 florins for the painting and commissioned a copy to be made by Michiel Coxey. And only when the copy was finished, the original would be moved. And Coxey actually painted quite a few copies of paintings by Van Weyden and by Van Eyck. And frankly, he was pretty good at it. The easiest way to tell them apart is to look at the frame. After it was finished, the copy that is, the painting was taken to one of the palaces of the Habsburg, awaiting transport to Spain, and eventually it was put on a ship. But as it happened, the ship sank. But fortunately, the painting had been packed carefully, and as it turned out, the chest it was in floated, and so it washed ashore somewhere, and the painting was barely damaged. It was then moved to the chapel of El Pardo, which is one of the palaces outside of Madrid, and then a few years later to the Escorial, where it was in the private collection of King Philip II, and would stay in the royal collections until it was transferred to the Prado in Madrid in 1939, and there it still is to this day. But we know that in Spain in 1566, Philip II had new doors made for it by Juan Fernández Navarrete, also known as El Muro, but unfortunately those doors have been lost to time. But it shows us that they too saw this as an altarpiece and therefore it needed doors or wings, and it really looks like the central part of an altarpiece, much more so by the fact that it looks as if it's set in a very shallow space. It looks as though it's carved in relief, and that, as it happens, was a very normal way of making altarpieces. Quite often, the central image of an altarpiece was made in a wood carving instead of in a painting. And I can't show you one that's contemporary to Rogier van Eyck because unfortunately those are all lost. That is because in the 16th century, not that long after Philip II started his reign of the Low Countries, there was an iconoclast wave that went through the Netherlands, known as the Beeldenstorm. It started as simple protests out of poverty and hunger, and it became a religious protest in favor of Protestantism. But no matter the reasons, it meant that images in churches were systematically destroyed, and we lost literally countless numbers of works of art. Often the doors of altarpieces could still be salvaged because sometimes you could see these protests coming and you could hide them or perhaps take them home or something. But it was more difficult to do that with carved images because they were bigger and more bulky. So most of them were burnt. So to give you an idea of what they might have looked like, I'll show you one by Veit Stoss, which was made in the 1480s for St. Mary's Basilica in Krakow. And many an altarpiece would have a central scene that was carved in relief in wood. That would be polychromed, which means painted in lively colors. And it seems as if van der Weyden imitated that effect, because you can see that around the edges there's this shadow that shows us that this is a shallow space. And it's even covered by this bit of tracery as if that is the front of this imagined space. But what is it that we're actually looking at? It is of course a descent from the cross, which was a fairly normal scene to see in a painting. The subject was depicted all the time. Here's one, for instance, made in the 14th century, so about a century earlier, and it was probably made in Italy, where we see the body being lowered from the cross. And here's one by Fra Angelico, which was made at the same time as the one by Rogier van der Weyden, which is nice because then we have something to compare it to. But what does it depict exactly? Well, the scene we see is of course pretty straightforward. We know Jesus was crucified and we know he was buried, so somewhere in between he had to be taken down from the cross, right? It makes sense that it was done, but it's only mentioned in one of the four Gospels and then in only one sentence. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 53, it states that Joseph of Arimathea took the body down. Actually, all the four Gospels mentioned that he was the one who went to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus, and then he buried him. Just none of the others mentioned that he took it down. It's a detail, I know, but you might wonder why people would depict the scene that is mentioned only in passing in the Bible. But I'll get back to that. For now, let's figure out who is who in this group of people. Well, there's Jesus, obviously, whose body is being lowered from the cross by three men. We can see his body is limp, and we can see all the wounds from the nails and the wound in his side where he was pierced. In the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 34, we read that he was pierced in his side and blood and water gushed out. And we can see here that all of this has happened a while before because all the blood has dried. It's not flowing down with gravity anymore, it sticks to his body. Before it ran down his leg though, and it stained his loincloth. He's also still wearing his crown of thorns, but other than that his body is pretty clean. That is, there's no wounds from the flagellation that happened before the crucifixion. Now, some people have written about this, saying that the position his body is in is reminiscent of a crossbow. And you remember, this altarpiece was commissioned by a crossbow guild. And I always think that's a bit far-fetched, because there's already little crossbows in the corners, and really the position of his body is reminiscent of his crucifixion. But then again, it turns out that in the late medieval period, sometimes Christ on the cross was compared to a crossbow to fight evil with. So who knows, maybe it was something people associated it with. But at the same time, of course, it's simply reminiscent of the crucifixion. So, who are all the other people there? The one on the ladder, I assume, is a servant. Mostly because he's doing the dirty work. You see, he has these two bloody nails in his hand and he's trying to lower the body while standing on this awkward ladder. By the way, if we zoom in, I love the fact that his sleeve is almost caught on the tracery. And now that we're up close, we can see that he's actually pretty well dressed. Just look at the fabric of his jacket and the pattern that's been woven into it. But there are two men who receive the body, and those are usually identified with Joseph of Arimathea, who is mentioned in all the four Gospels as the one who asked for the body and had it buried. The other man must be Nicodemus. He's only mentioned by John in chapter 19, verse 38. He had apparently come to Jesus during the night at some point, and now came with myrrh and aloes. It's even mentioned that he brings 75 pounds of it, which sounds like a lot, but what do I know? I have no experience in embalming people. But the fact that it's mentioned probably means that it was a lot. Now, we're not sure which of these two men is which. Both are richly dressed, and they are both rich and powerful men in the story. But my bet is that the man in red is Joseph of Arimathea, because he is most active in bringing down the body. And just look at how brilliantly his clothing is painted. He's wearing a fur coat, and the red material of his sleeves, I guess, is velvet. And just look at those little jewels set in the hem of his sleeves. And he's receiving the body in an awkward stance. Clearly he's never done this before. And Van der Weyden made sure that we could see that. Just look at the way he placed his feet. Also, you can see that he's trying his very best not to touch the body with his hands. He tries to keep this white linen cloth between his hands and the body itself, which is something you do with things that are sacred. Often you see that even the Bible would not be touched directly by priests, but they would have linen cloth in between their hands and the Bible. And we can see that the other man is doing the same thing. Of course, this linen cloth is also supposed to be the shroud. But then, of course, the other man must be Nicodemus. He's also richly dressed. He's in a coat of fur with gold thread, so he must be one of the two rich guys. And he's also clearly not used to physical work. And we can see that again in the way that his feet are placed. He's standing very awkwardly as well. But he's doing his best and he's clearly sad. I do have to admit though that there are two schools within art historians. Some would agree with me that this is Nicodemus and the man to the left is Joseph of Arimathea, and others switch them around and say that this is Nicodemus and this is Joseph of Arimathea. And up to a point you could really switch them out. It doesn't really matter. Except for this detail, and that's the man behind the man that I think is Nicodemus. Because I think that this is another servant who is holding a jar, and that could be a reference to the myrrh that Nicodemus brought. But I do admit that there's a problem with that. You see, the woman right next to him is mentioned in 3 of the 4 Gospels to be present or at least nearby when the crucifixion happened, and that's Mary of Magdalene. Now, the interpretation of her role in the entire story can vary widely. Some say she was just a follower, others have called her a full disciple, and yet others have said that she was the girlfriend or even wife of Jesus. And then there's the story that she was a prostitute who decided to follow Jesus, and I'm not going to get into which is which. But the stories in the Bible mention her on several occasions. One is at the cross, another when she goes to embalm Jesus' body. But there's an earlier scene where a woman in Bethany anointed the feet of Jesus. She's never called Mary of Magdalene in the Gospels, but she was widely seen as the same woman. In Matthew 26, Jesus actually says that this woman is preparing him for burial. And since it's Mary of Magdalene that later had that role, it kind of makes sense that they're the same person. Now, in Luke chapter 7, she kneels at his feet and cries tears over them. And she then dries off the tears with her own hair and puts her expensive perfumes on his feet. So because of these stories, Mary Magdalene is depicted with her jar of perfumed ointments. It's her attribute. But here she's standing at the feet of Jesus, which is an echo of the earlier story where she cried over his feet when he was still alive. So clearly this is Mary Magdalene, but her attribute, an expensive alabaster jar, she can't hold it here, because then she couldn't wring her hands in this dramatic way. But it's right beside her, held by the man in the background. The problem is that I've already told you that that could also be a servant of Nicodemus. So which is which? Well, that's the sort of thing that we art historians can argue about over drinks. But one explanation could be that this one jar does both jobs, is both the myrrh of Nicodemus and is the jar of Mary Magdalene. So who's on the other side of the cross? Well, there's a group of 4 people there, 3 women and a man. The man is easy. He's the youngest of the apostles, John. In his own gospel, he calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he describes that he was near the cross with the Virgin Mary, although she's called the mother of Jesus there. And Jesus says to his mother that he, meaning John, that disciple, is her new son, and to that disciple, John, that Mary is his new mother, and he is to take care of her. And the same gospel also mentioned that there's a sister of Mary there, who's also called Mary, and is married to Cleophas. And he also mentions Mary of Magdalene. Now, the 3 other Gospels say that there are various Marys at the cross, or at least nearby. They all say that there's a group of women that have followed them from Galilee. And they all mention by name Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph and James, and Mary the mother of Zebedee's sons, or that's Mary Salome. So there's quite a few Marys, but not Mary the mother of Jesus, strangely. Only John mentions her. So with all these Marys, it makes sense that the women in the background are both called Mary, which actually means that all the women in this entire painting are all called Mary. And usually these 2 women are identified with Mary Cleophas and Mary Salome. They are both mothers of disciples and half-sisters of the Virgin Mary, that is, according to tradition. Now, one of the lovely things you can see here is that this entire group is dressed much more simply than the group on the other side. That is because they are not mentioned to be rich. They are the poor disciples and followers, except for Mary Salome, whose husband had more money, so her skirt is finely woven. But of course the main figure in the foreground is the Virgin Mary, who is fainting. Now, as I mentioned before, this scene isn't really mentioned in the Bible that much, so her fainting there isn't either. Still, we see her fainting in lots of depictions of the Passion of Christ. Sometimes while he's carrying the cross, sometimes while he dies on the cross, and in this case during the descent. None of this is mentioned in the Bible. In fact, as I said before, the only mention of her at the cross is when she's very much awake and Jesus says to John and Mary to take each other as mother and son. But the idea of the fainting Virgin Mary was quite popular, and so you see it quite often. These days it's called the swoon of the Virgin Mary. It became a fashionable image in the late medieval period, and some religious orders, particularly the Franciscans, lobbied to get it its own feast, but that never happened. Mainly because others said it wasn't mentioned in the Bible and therefore not part of the true story. In the 16th century, Protestants rejected it completely, and the Counter-Reformation often rejected it as well. But at the time when this was painted, that controversy hadn't really started yet, so Mary could swoon at her leisure. We see here echoing the body of Jesus. You see, her arms are held in almost exactly the same way. And there may well be a good reason for that. And that is that she is following the example of Jesus. You see, in the north of Europe, especially in the Low Countries, there was a growing and popular form of modern mystical devotion. It was actually called the modern devotion. And it had been founded by a man called Geert Grote in the previous century. He had lived in Deventer, which is a city in the northern Low Countries, which is nowadays the Netherlands. And his movement focused on the personal relationship of the believer with God. One of its most prominent followers was Thomas à Kempis, and he had recently published a book called The Imitation of Christ, which is about following the life lessons of Jesus, but also about feeling the emotions and the pain of Christ during his passion. Now, there had been a long tradition and evolution in the image of Christ on the cross. During early Christianity, he was rarely depicted on the cross, but when he was alive and awake and almost regal. And during the 10th century, he started to become depicted as a person in pain. And that meant that the suffering of Jesus became a more important part of devotion. Now, in the 15th century, the feeling of the people around him that are suffering, have sorrow, feel with Jesus and lament his loss started to become part of the way people devoted themselves to this story. And the book of Thomas à Kempis is a prime example of how people started doing this. And it seems clear that Rogier van Eyck, or the people who commissioned this painting, were aware of this book called The Imitation of Christ. Because clearly the feeling of loss and sorrow is the main message in this painting. And this is a form of devotion that started in the north of the Low Countries and would spread outward from there. And by the 1430s it had become popular throughout the Low Countries, but had not yet spread to Italy, for instance. If we just for a moment compare it to the painting by Fra Angelico that I showed you before, we see all the same people depicted. The group of women with Mary of Magdalene at the front kissing the feet of Jesus, and the Virgin Mary sitting just behind her, who hasn't fainted in this case, and she and all the other people are clearly sad, but it's nowhere as much the focus of the painting as it is with Rogier van Eyck. So it's very much part of the northern approach to the scene to have everybody in tears. And it was much admired for that. But it's not just her tears, as I said before. Here we see Mary, who is fainting in almost exactly the same pose as her son. She's literally copying, imitating Jesus. And most likely that struck a chord at the time. By the way, there's one more person in the painting that I haven't discussed yet. And that's the one we see right next to Mary's hand. There's a skull there. And there's a good reason for that. Two of them, in fact. First of all, in several of the Gospels it's mentioned that the crucifixion takes place on Golgotha. And it's also said that that means the place of the skull. Now you might imagine that that's simply the place where executions take place. And then it would be a fitting name. But there's more to it. You see, there's a story that is traditional, not biblical, but often told throughout the ages. And that is the story of Adam and the legend of the cross. You see, when Adam was about to die, his son Seth went back into paradise to get fruit from the tree of life. His plan was to make some juice from those fruit and rejuvenate his father. But by the time he got back, Adam had died. So instead he took the seeds from the fruit, put them in his father's mouth, and then they buried him. And from those seeds a tree would grow. And that tree would eventually be cut down and two different beams would be made from it. And those two beams have their own legends. For instance, they tried to use them in the Temple of Solomon, but they didn't quite fit anywhere. And eventually they were used to make the cross. Now all of these are legends of the cross and there's much more to them, and they warrant a completely different video, maybe several. But the point is that those two beams made up the cross, and the cross in a way is the tree of life. Because the promise of the Christian faith is, of course, look at the cross, that is, follow Jesus and you will have eternal life. And that makes this the skull of Adam. It also makes for the circle of sin, the original sin committed by Adam and Eve, and the redemption that comes with Jesus. So that's why you can very often see a skull at the foot of the cross. Now, as I said before, this painting became very influential. Its swooning Mary and the deeply felt emotions would echo through the ages as artists started to emulate it, because this painting was copied quite often. I mentioned one of them before, when it was copied to replace the original, when Philip II of Spain bought the original, but that was actually not the first copy ever made. There had already been one made within a decade after the original was finished. It's called the Edelheren Triptych, and it was commissioned in 1449 for a different church in the same city of Leuven. But many other copies were also made throughout the ages. There was even an engraved version made, which meant that it could be printed on paper, and that was published in the 16th century, which meant that the image would spread throughout Europe much more quickly. And influential as it is, I mean, some have called it the most influential painting of all of early Netherlandish painting, it's easy to overlook its flaws. One is that the depth that we can see in the painting isn't really consistent. You see, at the top there's very little space, and there's much more of it at the bottom. But more than that, in order to fit everything in the space of the painting, Rogier van Eyck had to make some compromises. One is that the cross is ridiculously narrow. If we look at the body of Jesus and imagine his hands being nailed to the ends of that cross, he would have had his hands almost directly over his head, and that would mean that he would be standing comfortably on the ground. Also, the legs of the Virgin Mary are unnaturally long, but he needed that for his composition. But because it's so well made, you don't notice these things at first. It usually takes annoying art historians like me to point them out. But luckily, they're also easy to forget when you start looking at the painting and its lovely details again. And of course, you can see those best when you go and see it in the Prado in Madrid. But before you pack your bags and head off to Spain, please remember to like and subscribe, and perhaps you could even share this video with people you think might be interested. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and see you again soon. Bye.